Hey guys, in about 2 weeks we'll be getting our newest limited harmony added to the roster, but rather than go into leaks or anything of the sort, I want to take a look at harmony as a whole and examine the trends and expectations that have made the class become such a big deal in the first place, and where better to start than the original 3 harmony units themselves. You see, when Honkai Star Rail released its first 3 Harmony characters, they also formed 3 initial archetypes for Harmony characters, the single-target action advancers, the AoE Buffers, and a single-target-ish focused third category I'll call the Anomalies. And I have reason to believe that these 3 archetypes that these characters fill define what we perceive as the standards for Harmony units today. Let's start with arguably the most straightforward of these archetypes in our action advancers. Bronya kicked off this archetype, and as our first 5-star Harmony, she comes loaded with buffs. A single target damage steroid plus cleanse, plus an AoE attack and crit damage boost tied to her ult, on top of 10% damage just for existing, and some minor bonuses for the first few turns. Most crucial though, is that her skill grants the chosen DPS an immediate turn, providing them with double turns should Bronya act right after the DPS does. However, it isn't all upside, as her damage buffs have a limited duration, leaving huge windows of downtime, and her skill spam heavy playstyle makes her extremely SP hungry if played optimally. Sure, basic skill rotations did exist, especially with her talent letting her advance by 30% per basic, but skill spam was still favorable overall, and most times you'd rather let your DPS basic win out of SP to preserve Bronya's usual -1 speed skill spam rotation. Despite these limitations though, it seems that Hoyo thought, and quite correctly I might add, that turn doubling was extremely powerful even in a kit as restricting as Bronya's. And as such, we didn't get another action advance support until a whole version later, with the introduction of Sparkle in 2.0. Sparkle seemed to be a direct response to Bronya, offering the same assortment of crit damage, and attack buffs, but this time weighted much more towards crit damage, and most crucially, all of these buffs had pretty much 100% uptime, letting follow-up attackers take full advantage of them. Additionally, Sparkle was, and honestly still is, the best SP generator to date. Her technique generated 3 SP at the start of battle, her SP cap increased by 2 to prevent overflow from her 4 SP ult, and she had the rare ability at the time to basic instead of skill for the same energy, infrequently used as it was. This meant that Sparkle could usually generate an average of 2 SP a turn over the course of a run, especially considering how sometimes external energy let her gain 2-turn ults. However, all these positives are overshadowed by a singular but crucial downside. She only advances characters by 50%. On the whole, this means that her SP generation was actually less than this ideal plus 2-ish per turn, since to fully utilize it she had to run super fast. And giving less turns for the DPS to potentially basic can technically count as its own kind of SP loss too. And so with all that in mind, Sparkle could still find herself in situations where Bronya outperformed her, though the sheer difference in turns, despite being SP positive and having much better uptime on her buffs. There is a silver lining to being forced to run a -1 setup though, and that's the ability to run offensive boots on your DPS, making her hyper carry buffs even stronger than what was listed in her kit directly. And finally, we get to Sunday, who we can basically consider a version 3 support at this point. Released in 2.6, Sunday came with slightly lower crit damage and damage buffs than Sparkle, but with the additions of both max energy and crit rate to his arsenal, rare buffs that instantly spiked his value as a generalist single-target buffer. Not only that, but he returned back to form, adopting Bronya's cleanse and instant turn, on top of having his kit tailor-made to give extra oomph to summon base DPS. And just like Sparkle, his buffs are permanent, with his crit damage buffs ticking down on his own turns and having its 3-turn duration match his 3-turn ult rotation. Not only that, but his crit rate buff lasts 3 turns, letting him play extremely well with crit DPS who love to boost themselves forward in the action order. His damage buff also lasts a full 2 turns, keeping the DPS amped both on the turn they were advanced and the turn right before they get advanced again. And I normally don't talk about temporary damage boosting techniques, but plus 50% damage to everyone for the first 2 turns is genuinely insane. Like, that's a level 10 Tingyun ults worth of amp, and suddenly just hands it to the team for free 99. After all that though, his SP generation also sits squarely between Sparkle's and Bronya's, being approximately neutral without his light cone, and a pretty decent generator with it. Unless your DPS and or supports are SP hungry, then this lets him sustain a skill rotation, which is really nice as he has absolutely no incentive for using his basic. Overall, outside of extreme cases where DPS either want way more SP, don't care as much about turns, or want to advance Robin, Sunday has so many things in his kit that he does well at, with so little disadvantages to speak of, that he's a clear winner for many teams that want to turn doubler. So, what trends can we observe from this behavior? Well, firstly, Hoyo seems to like releasing single target action advanced supports about once per patch version. For perspective, that's the same frequency as DDD rate ups, and we all know how rare those are. Otherwise, you can see these action advancers shift from AoE to single target, go from limited uptime on their buffs to always having it up, and gain more fixed rotation, having less and less incentive to do anything but skill the DPS forward. If a hypercarry support can't provide a whole array of permanent and mostly generic buffs from turn 1, all while being easy and straightforward to play, then you'll have to really dig deep to find their niches, or wait for DPS tailor-made to serve their kits to come along. And considering how long Sparkle had to wait before someone like Archer came along, it's not exactly a comfy wait. With all that said though, let's move on to our second and most arguably important of the archetypes, AoE Buffers. Before AoE buffs became the domain of archetype-defining limited 5-stars though, Asta, who was a free pickup for every account, was the only true AoE buffer we had, providing a team-wide 52.8 speed boost and 15.4% attack per charging stack she possessed, up to 77% at 5 stacks. Asta's purpose was simple, to let her team hit harder and more often. However, in order to maintain both her attack buffs and ult uptime, she needed to hit as many enemies as possible to keep her stacks and energy filled up. Her Eidolons help address both of these issues, but still, unless you're constantly hitting fire weak or skilling versus multiple enemies, it's a pain to keep this buff up at full uptime. Interestingly, she seems to be built with sub-DPS potential in mind, considering her damage and crit-related traces, having built-in defense stats, allowing her to focus more on offense, and the fact that her light cone gives 24% damage to everyone of the same element, including the user. It does make sense though. If your support is going to be an AoE buffer, why not let them take advantage of their AoE buffs as well? Well, of course, this philosophy only works in 1.x's early game, as after that point, Asta's only real damage contribution becomes Fire Break, but the intentions were definitely there. And we'll see that sub-DPS trend continue with our next AoE buffer, as well as our very first limited harmony all the way in 1.6, Ruan Mei. Without needing to break herself, she was capable of inflicting small but significant bursts of break damage whenever an enemy was broken, or attempting to recover from her ult's Thanatoplum Rebloom state. But of course, that's not what most people remember her for. At the time of her release, with team-wide 25% respen on close to zero downtime, she was one of the best buffers, period. And thanks to her technique pre-firing her skill at the start of battle, Ruan Mei's 68% damage steroid was not just permanent, but the first skill attached buff available from turn 0. The 10% speed was also nice for pushing speed breakpoints, and even the 20% break effect wasn't wasted, since she herself needed it in order to provide her full damage bonus. That being said, there's still one stat that, as of making this video, no other character grants team-wide buffs for. I am, of course, talking about weakness break efficiency. To this day, Mei's 50% weakness break efficiency makes her an irreplaceable staple versus of many of Apocalyptic Shadow's older bosses, as well as a necessity within the Super Break archetype. A quick aside about how to speed tune her, by the way. Normally, most players will ult after using basic on turn 1, keeping Mei's ult at a generally consistent 2/3 uptime. If you run this with a 120 speed plus automatic rotation, then generally you'll be stuck with a huge gap between turns 3 and 4, where you're praying for hit energy to reduce that red ult downtime or even get rid of it entirely. However, if you activate your ult at the start of Mei's turn, wasting the 5 energy per turn on her A4 trace, her ult buff will not tick down during this turn, allowing her to effectively retain it for 3 out of 3 turns before her next ult arrives. The only way to guarantee this though, is to suffer some ult downtime on turn 1. And so you'll generally want Fast Mei if holding your ult until the start of turn 2, which most teams will prefer. All of this to say that slow Mei usually isn't worth it outside of certain zero cycle scenarios, and that even in her best case scenario, she will usually start with 1 turn of downtime. Speaking of downtime though, let's look at everyone's favorite version 2 harmony, shall we? The first thing that stands out about Robin's buff profile is that huge attack steroid, providing around 1.1 to 1.3k attack in her ult's concerto state. This translates to huge gains for attack scalers, especially when considering that it's also being paired with 50% damage and 20% crit damage, or 45% for follow-up attacks. Easily the most infamous part of her kit though, is the fact that using her ult causes the rest of the team to rise to 0 AV. Hoyo has never printed this effect on another support's kit, and for very good reason. Giving not just your DPS an additional turns, but other supports and potentially sustains as well, on top of limited 5-star worthy buff numbers on herself, means more SP, more energy for their ults, and if using an action advancer, well shucks, even more turns on top of it all. And it's not even like Robin's restricted by low buff cooldowns. Her ult has either permanent or 1 to 2 turn downtime at the absolute worst, and while it does take 2 turns to set up, if you can action advance Robin's second turn earlier, it basically upgrades to an action advance for the whole team. And while Robin can't exactly skill the start of battle, her buff tickdown works exactly like Mei's. Plus, by advancing herself forward by 25% at the start of battle, it's pretty easy to make sure her skill goes off before your character's move anyways. Some of the strongest steroids for the whole team, on an ideally permanent uptime, on top of an ult that gives your team an extra turn. Sure, it's some work, but it's definitely worth it. But wait, Robin leaves the field when she ults. What does he do when she's locked out of her turn, unable to generate energy or SP or deal damage? Well, not to worry there. We talked about the effects of front-loading SP by advancing the whole team already, but whereas Ruan Mei converts break into damage instances, Robin converts every single hit into a fixed 300% attack damage proc, as well as 2 energy, accounting for the immutable 100% crit rate and 150% crit damage she gets while ulting. This has 2 effects. First, it means that Robin can actually hyper-carry with the right team setup, especially seeing as how she adds fixed damage to any hits, giving a chance for hit-based supports or weaker but spammier DPS to shine. In other words, she puts the harm in harmony, and the amount of extra damage she puts out is genuinely scary given the right supports. Second, since Robin can gain energy off turn, she can stack even more attacks, and in fact is much better at pulling off the 120 speed plus Von Whack trick than Mei is, especially since having attack boots instead of speed boots directly translates to more supporting and offensive benefits. With Robin's ult having a fixed speed, and its regen depending largely on off-turn energy, it's not like being faster would translate into more ults anyways. But, surprising as it sounds, not everyone had access to Robin, nor did having Robin necessarily mean your team too was set. Luckily though, during the exact same patch, came another 5-star Harmony AoE sub-DPS buffer who would follow the very design philosophy that Robin employed, all while occupying a very different niche. I'm of course talking about Harmony MC. Replace attack with super break, replace new damage per hit scalings with new damage per toughness scalings, replace damage and crit damage with break effect, and you basically have a Robin who doesn't lock herself out of using their ult with alternative scalings. In fact, HMC takes a different approach to ultimates, spamming their ult to get as much value out of it as humanly possible, either through equipping Dance 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 to get as many partial Robin advances as possible, or the slightly worse option of Ruan Mei's signature to generate a boatload of SP. I say slightly worse because 1, it's a limited light cone, and 2, break can only ever need so much SP, but no one can ever have too many turns. Especially since more turns means more ult cycles, letting the Dance Dance revolution feed into itself. Both Robin and HMC even generate energy outside of their turn, with HMCs being based on breaks inflicted instead of hits. And finally, being a more active turn taker, Harmony MC actually takes our skill and curation from Asta, but better. Doubling the initial targeted hit's toughness, adding an extra bounce hit, and of course having the appropriate scalings to actually sub DPS with it. Tell me that a 10 stack Lightning Lord's worth of toughness can't deal respectable super break damage, I dare you. And the best part is, as enablers of 2 different archetypes, they don't really have overlapping supports. Robin can run her follow crit team on one side, and Stell or Kalis can run break on the other. Of course, that's version 2's take on Harmonies. What would version 3 look like? Well, let's take Robin's energy and damage per hit, Harmony MC's utility to ult spam, Ruan Mei's debuffs and res pen, and finally, for good measure, have them constantly want to hit a lot of enemies, like Asta. You know what the result ended up being. Well, actually, let's dig into this further. Her ult scales off max HP, which she increases based off her team when she ults. It also deals max HP per enemy hit, and also regains energy so she can ult spam even more. Her follow-ups are 18% max HP and also get ramping 216% damage for some reason. Her basic is just a normal basic, but the fact that it's blast just leans way more into her self-sufficient damage dealing system. I almost wouldn't be surprised if they made an AoE basic just for her. And that's just her base kit. Let's look at the light cone. For starters, it gives her 84% crit damage. Yeah, it's an extra 106 base HP over all the other 5-star options too, so about a 5% base HP increase. But versus a 4-star light cone, like say DDD, it's a whopping 16% HP increase. And for the real kicker, 21 energy per follow-up. That's a 420% extra increase in follow-up energy. Imagine if you took someone like Dr. Ratio and told them, yeah, you can regen your ult in 5 follow-ups now, 4 if you equip an ERR rogue. Is that not insane? I know that people joke, Tribbie is a DPS, Tribbie showcase, yada yada yada, but I think what needs more recognition is that if Tribbie self-buffs and light cone were given to any other DPS, they go kinda crazy. Yeah, is anyone really surprised that Hyacine is the closest analog? Anyways, let's veer away from the wheelchair discussions and observe long-term AoE Harmony trends for a sec. With the exception of Harmony MC, who is a strong, independent character who don't need no speed restrictions, AoE Harmonies have started fast and gotten slower over time. For the most part, this is a positive trend, since AoE support buffs tick down on their own turns, but depending on the specifics of your run, whether you want them slow or not could change. And before you think Tribbie's an exception, with Poet, her intended DPS set, she hits 88.32 speed with no substats. Robin's ult has a base speed of 90. They also have progressed, much like the single targets, from limited conditional uptime to permanent effortless uptime, giving you play to their archetype strength. This is because they don't rely on regenerating their own energy anymore, instead able to count on teammates to help regain their ults. And rather than being buffers with insignificant but appreciated DPS, more and more it's starting to feel like Harmony less so and more like harm only. In fact, we've reached a point where I think the actual DPS AoE Harmonies put out is being a bit overappreciated, shall we say. It's definitely significant, don't get me wrong, but it's not like I've done any runs, for instance, where I've hard relied on Tribbie's damage. Anyways, with both the single target and dominant AoE archetypes covered, there's only one left to cover. Okay, because trying to categorize them outside of not AoE buffers or single target action advancers doesn't actually tell us much, let's first figure out what's unique about each of the anomaly supports. Tingyun, first and foremost, has an ult that gives her 60 energy. Not only that, but her technique lets her fill up her ult and activate it at 0 AV. Obviously, DDD procs and low AV clears come to mind, as does the good old Eagle set. Notably, however, being able to target any character of your choosing as soon as the battle starts also makes Tingyun incredibly synergistic with Sacerdos. Good luck getting a 184 plus speed Sacerdos set if you want to copy some low-cost clears though. Tingyun is also the first character to imbue the DPS with additional damage procs. Interestingly, it seems that Tingyuns and the MC's extra damage instances count as the buff DPS's damage and always credits the DPS for the kill, but in the case of limited 5 stars, like Jade, Robin, and Tribbie, their additional damage counts as kills for them, which can be a double-edged sword depending on whose ult you want up. Ting can also grant 5 energy per kill, which usually doesn't matter as much since it can only trigger once a turn, but it may be useful for avoiding those curse of 1% energy moments. And finally, our Foxian friend can apply a 20% speed buff to the DPS for 1 turn after said DPS ults. Usually this isn't too impactful either unless you plan around it, as conditional, ult-based speed buffs aren't as impactful as just getting them straight up and immediately. Just look at 4P's Messenger for crying out loud. And as for Yukong, oh boy. First the good. Her max buffs are actually insane. 29.4 crit rate, 70.2 crit damage, and 88% attack far outclasses Sunday on an attack scaling crit DPS, and is actually quite on par with Robin's in there. But of course, those buffs are tied to a very finicky turn-based downtime. Yukong is the only character in the game who has buffs that tick down upon any ally taking a turn. This, though, actually makes her synergize interestingly well with allies that take enemies' turns to deal damage, like Clara, characters who depart themselves like Moza, and characters who depart everyone else, and enemies that provide extra turns, like Phynon as both an ally and an apocalyptic shadow enemy, respectively. Yukong is also the first character to gain energy per ally action, something that Huohuo would later adopt and was reused in more specific cases by Misha, who needed SP consumed, and Robin and Tribbie, who needed enemies hit. And finally, the Weir. Yukong's basic deals 100% toughness reduction basically every other turn, and this is the first time any character has ever received this sort of increase. Heck, it even outdates Ruan Mei's weakness break efficiency, with only the SU buff technically coming before. Other characters that would later receive toughness reduction include Boothill, Harmony MC, March Hunt specifically, and E2 Rappa. Our last anomalous Harmony in the timeline is Hanya, though luckily she's a more straightforward case. Hanya, like Tingyun, only buffs the attack and speed of her and the DPS she ults, though even Hanya's high base speed and 15% advance forward per ult buff DPS kill, she doesn't end up giving more to the DPS in terms of speed, or attack for that matter, than Asta does. But what most people know her for is her ability to store SP, either being net +1 for SP every skill, or +2 if the 4th attack on the burdened target lands a kill. Sparkle, being released 2 patches later, does this job a whole lot better, but Hanya does it while consistently attacking. This is more useful for attack-based mechanics like facial stack generation, war armor, and dispelling Hulei's Terror Grip, to name some notable examples. Something curious you might have noticed is that there aren't any 5 stars among the 3 anomalies, and I think, for now, that leads me to the conclusion that these characters are meant to be testing grounds for certain mechanics. Tingyun for energy and additional damage procs, Hanya for storing SP and attack spam, and whatever heck of a motley Yukong is. If the non-AoE buffers and non-single target action advancers are just meant to be prototypes for future character kits, it makes sense why none of the few 3 that qualify for that niche are 5 stars, much less limited 5 stars. Hoyo wants to ideally release limited units with completed kits and clearly defined roles. Well, even if those roles initially come with restriction caps for some reason. And I think that brings me to my main point. There are certain models that, whether we want to acknowledge them or not, affect how we view upcoming harmonies in Honkai support rail. It's not enough for a unit to just be a Bronya, they have to be a Sunday. And no way in heck can we be having Astas or Ruan Meis when Tribbie and Robin are the ones defining the meta right now. Harmony's identity, as crazy as it sounds, seems to be homogenizing. Forget trying to set interesting rotations. 133.4 Sunday, only spamming skills and ults on your DPS, take it or leave it. Robin will always be on her signatures, or in very rare cases, Tribbie's, and paired with Fonwag. And why use Dance 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 Tribbie as an AoE Amper when her S1, if available, lets her be the AoE DPS and still provides a 48% team-wide crit damage steroid? Besides for break teams and cost chesting, that is. At least, that's a sentiment that I feel seems to be permeating today's meta discussion. Why try and be innovative with XYZ when you can just pump up costs in wheelchair? And sure, I get it, Tribbie and Hyacine are stupid strong, and putting them both on a team will likely clear every single endgame mode out right now. But that doesn't mean that every single endgame clear is optimally solved by them, and even if it was somehow, you still have 2 other teammates plus 4 more on the other side left to work with. I feel like that there's this idea that niche supports that don't fit into the generalists with specialized best-in-slot roles, like Sunday, Tribbie, and Robin do, are just destined to be the Tingyuns of this game. Sure, they can do cool stuff that no one else can, but at the end of the day, they'll still be weaker overall than the true meta 5-star supports, unworthy of their limited 5-star status. And well, if I were to make some predictions, it seems very likely that Cerydra is going to be one of those niche supports. Let me explain. We still haven't hit 4.0 to allow us our once per version single target action advancers, and for AoE buffers, Tribbie has the current HP scalers covered, Robin has the attack scalers, and Ruan Mei has the weird players who still want to play break teams in 2025. And sure, there's the ever-burning Phynon in the room, but how do you make a generic AoE Amper for a character who goes solo and kicks everyone else off the team when Robin already exists and doesn't synergize great with herself? Who knows? Maybe this will age poorly, and Cerydra will finally be the true Bronya upgrade we've all been waiting for. Or maybe she'll just suck. But either way, whether she debuts as a number 1 or as a nixed out niche, I'm excited for the upcoming discussion that awaits when this Chess Grandmaster hits the live servers, because if I can count on nothing else, it's that the community will always miss something when it comes to evaluating a character, myself included. Something that can only be discovered through actually playing them yourself. Thanks for watching.